Okay, so we'll that's just a wee bit tied up next door, so we'll get that. Here we are. So we'll move into resource management national direction changes. So we're going to hear all about it, and welcome.
Yeah.
Kia ora. So we're here today to brief on the proposed changes to RM National Direction, but we're also looking forward to a discussion on potential areas of interest for the council submission, and we'll also outline how staff are approaching drafting the submission. Next slide. We do have a clicker, I apologise. We'll test the technology.
Oh, sorry.
It's all good.
Never works without.
So before we get into the detail of the proposed changes, we just wanted to provide an overview of where these changes sit in the broader reforms process. So the proposed changes to national direction are the final part of phase 2. So phase 2 has focused on the targeted changes to the RMA to deliver the government priorities. They were often seen as, well, they were seen as the quick wins. Phase 3, which is the replacement RM legislation, is still anticipated to be released later this year, most likely following the local body elections. But a question that you may have is why are they undertaking consultation on the national direction ahead of those broader reforms to the RM? This is something that we'll discuss later on in this presentation and potentially could be a submission point that we raise. So what are the government consulting on at this stage? They're proposing changes to RM National Direction. National Direction is a term used to describe national policy statements, national environmental standards, and national planning standards. That's a very technical planning jargon, and we will go into detail of what those mean in the next slide. The government is consulting on 3 packages. They're on the right there. Package 1 is infrastructure and development. Package 2 is primary sector. Package 3 is freshwater. It's important to note that across the 3 packages, there are changes to instruments in all 3 of the packages. So that means we need to look at it holistically as well as those individual packages. So packages are just how the government has decided to group the changes. There's also a 4th package going for housing growth. That was set to be released in early June. We're now the 17th of June. I don't think it's been released to date. So we anticipate that that will be released soon. So briefly, what is national direction? As I said, there's 3 under the RMA. So there's the national policy statements, national environmental standards, and the national planning standards. The national policy statements set the direction for council when drafting plans or making decision on resource consents. They do this through prescribing a set of objectives and policies which are matters of national significance. We've put the example there of urban development as an example of a policy statement, but there's various policy statements under the existing RM framework. The next is your national environmental standards, and these are very prescribed standards. We've also put methods or other requirements for environmental matters there. Every council must enforce these standards, and the purpose is to enable that consistent approach nationally.
Just to add, our district plan has objectives, policies and rules. The rules act as triggers. Effectively in that hierarchy of national direction, national policy statements are the policy framework. The standards are the rules. So the national environmental standards are effectively a national set of rules that applies to every council and don't need a plan change to put into every district plan. Those standards, those rules apply regardless.
And the final one is national planning standards. These are set to make plans easier to prepare, understand, and also comply with. The first set of standards set the direction for consistency in the structure, form, definitions, and accessibility of the plans. Might want to add to that.
Those standards came in and there was often quoted over 50 definitions of height across the country. And so those standards set a consistency in terms of defined terms, but also sorts that the contents page of every district plan looks the same, that the chapters are structured the same. So whether I'm looking at the Wairoa district plan or the unitary plan or Christchurch district plan, the intent was that they looked the same.
I'll pass over to Mark, who's going to run through the details of package 1 and package 2.
So the first package on infrastructure and development is apparent. It's intended to make it easier for councils to plan and deliver infrastructure, and I'll come on to explain what that encapsulates. In the right-hand side, there's various national planning instruments that we've just talked about in general terms that changes are proposed to, or there's new national direction coming. So the first of those is a national policy statement on infrastructure. There's not currently a policy statement on that. That's got the intent of being more enabling of the delivery of infrastructure. Infrastructure captures 3 waters, transport assets, so the what commonly think of, but it also captures social infrastructure. So the term social infrastructure is defined in the discussion paper as including hospitals, emergency services, education, defence, corrections, but in the context of what council administers, parks, resource recovery, waste disposal facilities. And so this framework is seeking to provide a more enabling tool for more enabling policy direction to support those assets. It acknowledges that infrastructure, because of its functional requirements, does need to be in locations that may not otherwise be suitable. For instance, assets that need to be in an area of significance for landscape values, and that recognition of functional or operational needs is proposed. Of note, there's also policy direction about how the effects between infrastructure and adjoining activities is managed. So there's examples of hospitals, for instance, in our residential areas, and that interface between residential and infrastructure can give rise to adverse effects. The policy statement makes it clear that effects like noise, vibration, dust, and visual effects do come with that infrastructure and can't be completely avoided. So the policy direction is, again, to provide that enabling direction that whilst there may be effects that are less of enjoyment to residents living next door, that is the nature of some of those activities that can't be avoided entirely. The second instrument is a national policy statement on renewable energy generation, and that's an existing tool, but the changes are to reduce consenting costs and enable that generation. Wind turbines being a relevant example, and that's come about for examples in the past of wind farms, particularly up north, where there's been significant consent processes that have gone to the courts, and the direction is to give greater weight to this policy direction of enablement over what a district plan might look like. The third one on electricity network activities. So at the moment, there's a national policy statement that's enabling of the national grid. So Transpower's national grid, the transmission lines, there's a set of policies that are enabling of that. This direction, this proposed change is to expand that to apply to Orion's network as well. So that Orion would also benefit from enabling policies and rules that would allow for permitted activities, as well as a more enabling framework for what they seek to do on a day-to-day basis. And that would extend to EV charging infrastructure as well. So as an example, that would include development of new distribution lines and cabinets if standards are met, which would be a permitted activity under the National Environmental Standard for electricity network activities. The next one on the list, National Environmental Standard on telecommunication facilities. So poles, cabinets, what's commonly referred to as cell phone towers. The intent is to, again, be more enabling. It's intended to update existing standards for poles, masts, cabinets, but to, importantly, to permit new poles in more areas. So There's currently restrictions on where in the road reserve that poles can be located. The intent is to allow them unrestricted in any part of the road reserve. There's also a proposal to permit them in zones where it's not currently permitted. So notably commercial zones, industrial zones, mixed-use zones, that would be permitted as a right. In the road reserve close to residential, the permitted height being proposed as one of two options is 20-metre tall masts, and other standards that would be more enabling. The next one on granny flats, there was a earlier discussion document out, which council made a submission on about permitting granny flats. That proposal from earlier in the year proposed a self-contained unit be permitted up to 70 square metres. That's been, 60 square metres. That's now been increased in this proposed national environmental standard to 70 square metres. In terms of the comparison with what the district plan permits at the moment, across a number of our residential zones, it's permitted to have a minor residential unit, it's called, of 80 square metres or 70 square metres in rural zones. But there are some more enabling standards that come with this national direction, including maximum building coverage of 50%. That's not too, that's same as what has come through in the medium and high density zones for Plan Change 14 as a comparison, but would be an increase in site coverage in a suburban context where we expect that to, because of larger sites existing in a suburban environment of one house on a large section, there's greater capacity in those locations for granny flats. So I expect that there'll be a greater take up in those locations and therefore a higher site coverage. It's also clear that we can't set rules for outdoor space, glazing, sunlight access, parking and access in respect of granny flats in this proposal. Second to last on this slide is Papakainga. This is new direction and is proposed to be more enabling on different types of Māori land, and is intending to permit up to 10 units on a site within rural, residential and Māori purpose zones, and to also permit some other activities, including commercial uses up to 100 square metres, visitor accommodation, education, health, recreation, marae, urapa. And then the last on the slide is a new national policy statement on natural hazards, which provides for direction on 7 different types of hazards, from flooding, landslips, coastal erosion and inundation, liquefaction, tsunami. It introduces at a national level a risk-based approach to how we manage hazards. That's not new to a Christchurch context. We have a risk-based approach, which effectively means you take a more restrictive approach in areas that are higher risk and consequence, and a more enabling approach in lower risk areas. The national policy statement seeking greater consistency across the country, and the intent is for that to have immediate effect on resource consent decision making, including private plan changes. That is not all. The second package on the primary sector, I'll just briefly cover off the key changes. The first on marine aquaculture, a new national environmental standards, is to make it easier for consent for research and trials for aquaculture, likely only relevant to Akaroa Harbour. There's an existing national environmental standard on commercial forestry. It's proposed to reduce what council has scope to introduce standards for. So at the moment, proposed forestry on the hills of Banks Peninsula is enabled, but council can put in place standards to be more restrictive. They're proposing to remove that discretion for councils, and only in very limited circumstances that council can have standards over and above what the national instrument proposes, and that's in cases of severe risk of erosion or an underlying risk that's been identified. Highly productive land, I'll just skip to the NPS on highly productive land. Key changes to remove, at the moment, class 1, 2 and 3 soils are protected under the existing national policy statement. It's proposed to remove class 3 soils. In a Christchurch context, it won't make a significant, won't have a significant impact because a lot of the soils around the edge of Christchurch are class 1 and 2. Notwithstanding that, we are seeing a number of private plan change requests coming in for residential and industrial development. So we'll continue processing those and consider how they implement the direction on highly productive land. The government is testing the idea also of defining areas as special agricultural areas. They've specifically mentioned Horowhenua and Pukekohe as areas that warrant protection, even if they're not class 1 and 2 soils. So that's an addition that's coming. And then in the interest of time, there's also greater enablement for quarrying and mining, including within wetlands under various national instruments.
Thanks, Mark, for that.
Wetlands.
So as you can see, there's quite a breadth of change being proposed under package 1 and package 2, and we'll go into package 3 shortly. But what we wanted to touch on is how we intend to focus our submission, given that it's covering a wide range of policy areas. So what we're proposing on the side over there is that we want to take a strategic or system focus. So that's really looking at how do the packages and how do the instruments within the packages work together? Are there any consistency issues, and are there any potential conflicts? We'd also like to look at implementation. So this is really looking at kind of, is it fit for purpose? Are there issues with interpretation? How do councils or staff apply those policies? And yes, time for delivery. And the third one there is what I mentioned earlier, was around how do we transition from the existing RM framework into the new system. So obviously phase 3 is intending to introduce the RM replacement legislation. This national direction is being drafted under the existing system. So staff are still working that through, but just understanding how that will work. The government has signalled that it will be able to transition into the new system, but we just need to do a bit of testing around that. And the fourth point is probably more of a discussion with you around potential areas of interest. So given that the policies are really, they're focusing on a range of differing policy issues, it's understanding what are those potential areas of interest for council. And as Mark has mentioned, there's a number that jump out there as well. So the final package is package 3. And just a point of, just to note, package 1 and package 2, this is the opportunity for consultation, and from there it will result in changes to the relevant instruments. For package 3, what the government are doing is they're taking a two-staged approach to looking at freshwater regulation. So this first phase is the government seeking options around freshwater regulation, in particular to the MPS freshwater management and the NES freshwater. So this is our opportunity in terms of commenting on those differing options and proposals that the government have put forward. They have signalled that they will be coming back later this year with a more detailed exposure draft on this. So the proposals or the options that they're seeking are identified on the slide on the right. There's 9 of them, and I'll explain a couple, well, the areas of potential focus we could look at on the next slide. Sorry. So in terms of potential focus regarding the freshwater regulation, the first is around the multiple objectives. So the government is seeking feedback on whether to replace the MPS FM single objective with new multiple objectives. And there's 4 new objectives in the discussion document that they've put forward. The second is around the rebalancing of Te Mana o Te Wai. And this is a discussion that would like to have with you. So the government, as you can see on this slide, is seeking feedback on 3 options to rebalance Te Mana o Te Wai. Option 1 is to remove the hierarchical obligations and clarify how Te Mana o Te Wai applies. Option 2 is reinstate Te Mana o Te Wai provisions from 2017, and option 3 is remove Te Mana o Te Wai provisions completely. As I mentioned, these are options, and obviously in our submission, there's the ability to put forward alternative options as well. The final point there is to also make is the government is also seeking feedback to when these changes to freshwater regulation should be taking effect. So the question is whether that should be pre the RMA replacement or post the RMA replacement. At the moment, we don't have any indicative views on that. Just to note that there have been a number of changes to freshwater regulation over the last number of years. And I guess from our perspective, it's that enduring, whatever changes are made, you want to ensure that they're enduring. So the final thing to cover off is just in terms of timeframes for the submission. We will be coming back to you on the 8th of July with the draft submission for a discussion on that. Following that information session, we plan to circulate the draft submission. And just to clarify, in terms of our approach to drafting the submission, we intend to do a brief cover letter that summarises key points, to keep that brief and strategic. And then we propose to do 3 differing appendices for each of the packages. That is where we can also address more technical matters around interpretation and things like that. So we want to have a short strategic and then focus on the detail in the appendices. So that's our approach. We will be taking the draft submission to FMP on the 23rd of July for your consideration. And then the submission will need to be lodged, sorry, there's a typo there. It needs to be lodged by Sunday the 27th, but for us that will be Friday the 25th. So those are our proposed timelines. So happy to have them.
And conscious of time today, so we're still in a preparation phase, so any written feedback or comments are welcome, and we can seek to reflect that.
That's very good, thank you. I have 4 questions. Pauline?
Yes, it's very unsettling in my view. Look, I think we've got to bring in that localism view again, and I didn't like that comment you made, removing council's ability to restrict. Particularly, you mentioned forestry, but I'm sure it'll apply to other things. The stock exclusion in wetlands is just shocking. LUC, that the class of the soils, that's had an immediate effect, that class 3. Right, so we can't do anything about that.
The class 3 is immediate effect, the removal of the soils.
I'll check that, but
I think it says in the slide, but you know, I think we need to hold on to and protect our versatile soils. We've already lost a lot, and particularly around Preston's, as that was rushed through as an earthquake response by the minister, and that had been previously declined to build there. So they were versatile soils in there. We've got others. But my question too is that, so rebalancing Te Mana o Te Wai, I would go for option 2, reinstate it. But if that was to come through with more relaxed, more liberal limited discharges, for example, our wastewater treatment plant out there, what they're trying to do is relax the amount of overflows that you can have by up to about 40 times more than we have now. If that was to come into law, would it be a scenario that a government could say, well, Christchurch City Council, your standards are up here, ours are down here, you should not be charging your ratepayer to reach that standard when they only need this standard. Is that a potential outcome of this? Brent?
Potentially, it's more of a conversation with the Commerce Commission when they're looking at value for ratepayers, where you can achieve a standard for a lesser amount, and you may need to go out and consult the public to justify it. Okay, so that would need to be a question raised in our submission then. And also, then would we have the ability to, restrict that particular restriction? Thanks.
Kia guys. Pauline's actually asked a lot of my questions, but one of the one I wanted to ask about was the granny flats provision. It's more around infrastructure. So, for example, they can put a granny flat in. Do they still need to apply consent for wastewater?
There's also changes to the Building Act that have come through and proposed, and we've just made a submission on that. I'd have to refer to that.
Yep.
Confusing, doesn't it? Resource consent, building consent.
Yeah, because it will have an effect on the infrastructure that we're able to push out, particularly our wastewater if we get granny flats.
With a high flood hazard area, like some areas of Sprayden, if you were going to do granny flat, you would have to supply, and I'm good to know that they've got the overflow. Some properties are required to have an overflow tank, so that takes the rainwater and slowly puts it back into the system. So that would be part of it as well.
I'd love to see the provisions in that, yeah.
Sorry, Caroline, are you talking wastewater or rainwater? Still?
Wastewater.
But rainwater would be exactly the same situation and Sprayden.
So for example, you got Stockburn, which is pretty much, well actually, so we'll talk about Upper Riccarton. It's going right up, right? And there's going to be more wastewater that's going to be going in. But if there are properties that are also going to be adding granny flats, 70 square metres, it's also going to apply more pressure to the wastewater infrastructure.
In any case, at the present time, council has a bylaw and administers connections through that bylaw such that
So we've got control over that, right? Whether we can permit.
it's just a question of whether the changes to the Building Act and other legislation excludes us from using the bylaw, but
Okay.
I can't foresee that.
So the question offline would be then, do we still have control over allowing these connections under this one or under the Building Act probably? That's probably the question I've got for later.
Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, so mine was around the wind farms. Does this make it easier or more changes?
Easier.
More enabling.
For the wind farms to come in? Okay, because I know someone who consents, they do the planning and it costs more to do the paperwork than it costs to put in the farm. So this will reverse that?
That's the intent, and the problem, Jeff, in the governance discussion document, the problem described is very much the costly nature of consenting and the inability to get paid.
Given that much in the way of wind turbines around Christchurch, do we have a city position on it?
I mean, we've flagged it, given there's potential in the future that locations on the Max Peninsula may be sought for a wind farm.
Right, or red zone? Yep.
I can't comment on the climatic environment required, but
Which is about the easterly, so might as well use it.
Okay. Victoria.
Thank you. Two questions. First on Te Mana OTY and the second on the focus of our feedback on packages 1 and 2. So Te Mana OTY, how does the Ngātahu water, freshwater claim play into, intersect with this, please? In terms of timing, in terms of objective and focus, what's the overlap? What are the challenges with it?
we can't comment on that, but we'll come back to you. What we can say though is we're engaging with Whitiora and Mahanui to get input to the submission. So
it's pretty complex. So the second one is the feedback, focus of our feedback. I note that the draft submission is coming to finance and performance, but there's nothing in slide 9 that talks about where we focus our feedback in relation to financial implications. Yeah, can you talk to that, please?
That is something that we've often covered in our submissions, and we can again look to cover that on from the proposed reforms for council and potentially for ratepayers
Okay,
as well.
and so you've broken it down in terms of a focus of our feedback on 1 and 2 and then 3. So the financial implications will cover all of our feedback, please, at the home.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Timothy?
Two, I'm not sure if one is relevant, but the first one is being able to restrict development in areas of high flood or potentially dangerous from earthquakes, etc. So reading this, I'm presuming it's going to make it easier. And I kind of think back to Napier, where a developer wanted to develop an area. The council really didn't want it to happen, but they couldn't really stop it. It seems to me to be ridiculous that people can develop on areas that are subject to flooding, etc., and it costs the city more. So how this seems to be on the side of developing that type of land, is that correct?
The national policy statement proposed on natural hazards defines what is deemed significant risk and then enables a proportionate response, so a more restrictive approach within areas of significant risk. So it ultimately it still requires a plan change to manage areas that aren't currently managed, and we're advancing a coastal hazards plan change. But we have already got in our district plan areas defined as high risk. We've got a high flood areas deemed at risk of flooding, both within areas affected, areas within the influence of the coast, but also right to the western edge of the city. So we do in our district plan manage risk, manage high risk areas.
Because let's be honest, we've spent hundreds or over $100 million on flood basins purely to stop flooding into the other areas downstream. But that's accentuated by the developments and basically what you describe as natural floodplains. So do we have the ability under this at any point to say no to an area?
This would provide policy support to a plan change that's being advanced. It's not a set of rules per se, it's policy direction, so we still have to implement that through the plan change, but it does, if it goes through in its current form, it will support the approach we're taking. Yeah, sure.
The second one is, if you are looking at the central city, we've got so many 2-bedroom units, it's ridiculous. And if we're trying to get a balance, as it was sold to us after the earthquake, trying to get or like in London. But if you look at those areas, they do have 1, 2, 3, 4, even 5-bedroom family homes and apartments. We have none of that, because as soon as you go to 3 or 4 bedrooms in central city, you're talking million plus. And I know this, I've been not looking for myself, obviously. But how do we go to a process, or are we looking at a process of, say, restricting certain size or bedroom? This would not.
That's really for package 4 of the Housing for Growth direction, which is still to come, and we'll report back separately on that. We'll see what's coming out, but the tone for all of these packages is being more enabling. So we'd have to consider how being more restrictive fits in with that context.
Well, technically, we would be more enabling for 3 and 4 bedroom, 3 plus, but yeah. Okay, look, I look forward to that one. Thank you. I mean, this one's been riveting.
Sarah, please.
Thank you. Quick things. Firstly, we've been having a lot of changes that we've been having to make, sort of one after the other. And this one is like a precursor to a larger change. Resource implications for us, not necessarily the cost, but when it comes to the staff time and resource that's being used on that, what is being pushed back to be able to cater for all the additional work?
There's 2 parts to this. The national environmental standards don't require a plan change to come into effect. They will
just
happen. So existing national direction on some of those matters, as well as contaminated land, are applied like the rules in the district plan, but they sit outside. The policy statements, particularly on natural hazards and other new national policy statements, they would require a plan change to implement that direction. Notwithstanding that national direction also can be considered for any resource consent application. So we may delay a plan change to implement some of this national direction, but it ultimately still had regard to the consent process.
Okay.
We'll report back in terms of how we need to wait the outcome of this, but we'll report back to you on the resourcing implications. And it really comes down to what is required in these national policy statements in the way of plan changes. So, for instance, the national policy statement on urban development did require us to do a plan change 14 by a certain date. Just need to go through the national policy statements and see what is being directed for councils to do a plan change and what's not directed.
Yeah.
For those not directed, there's scope for us to take longer.
Yeah.
And And to be honest, if we don't want to line up a whole lot of new plan changes to implement this new direction, if ultimately we have to prepare a whole new plan under the proposed legislation.
And for with things where we end up not doing a plan change, but there is that guidance or whatever that the developers do have to follow, does it make the process more difficult for them because the information's in different places, or?
The national environmental standards, ideally they're integrated into our plan, and we'll review the provisions because some under section of the Act we can directly put it in our plan without a plan change.
Great.
But we'll have to check the detail on that. But even if not, there's still the ability to implement those standards.
And the other one is so going back to like Aaron's point of the wind farms things and everything more enabling. How does this with this one as it stands and with the regulatory standard stuff as it stands, is there a conflict there? So things that making big things more enabling like wind farms, but then with regulatory standards saying, well, if you're going to have an impact on your neighbours, then you're going to have to pay for it. You know, where is the conflict in those two pieces of legislation?
It's something that we've identified that we need to look at, or staff need to look at when preparing the submission, is around those conflicting issues. And that's, I mean, whether that's through differing systems or whether that's through, I guess, the RM system with the differing the range of national direction proposed. But that's certainly on our radar for something to look at, is around those conflicting priorities or competing priorities in some instances.
I can't remember because I read a few days ago that our current submission that's going to council tomorrow on standards, because this is new, do we capture that in our current submission on the regulatory standards bill? Okay, so if we just have a look at that overnight before we can.
2 points. One about the stock exclusion regulations. Are there, have they given like a rationale for that? It talks about threatened stock species. It seems like, is there such a thing?
We'll need to come back to you on that.
It just seems extremely weird. The other one about the telecommunication facilities and the poles. What are I'd like to know what the current restrictions are, because obviously we have no control over that. You just go through the process. And there are people that get annoyed about them and other people that love them because they can use their Wi-Fi. More than effectively, but I mean, could it potentially mean there's a pole every 100 metres around every single street in the entire city?
Yeah, at the moment, the restriction of what can happen in the road reserve, a new mast its location is restricted relative to proximity to other poles. But there could be a situation where obviously there's only so many providers, so there's a limit to how many poles you'd have, but there's more flexibility of where the poles could be located in that street. In terms of the comparison between what's allowed at the moment and what's proposed, the height of so in the road reserve adjacent to a residential area, the height of the pole, what's permitted is determined based on the height of any existing poles. I'll come back with a fuller response, but the proposed option is to enable 20-metre high poles as a right without relativity tested.
Thank you. Now, we have 3 more questions, but we're so far over time. If you guys are available to do next door and the 3 people who are asking the questions, you don't know who they are, and come and have your answer. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Very good.